All it takes is one audacious move, and with just one significant raid, the Norsemen knew they could take on Europe. This is referred to as the Lindisfarne Raid, and the victims were the peaceful and remote monastic community of a priory whose abbey was rampaged and pillaged by the marauding Vikings that arrived from faraway Scandinavia. You might be wondering what led to this famous Viking raid. Well, quite a few things actually. First, the Viking society at the time was all about strength, courage, and military skills during their era. This was so important that it reflected in the transition of children into adults. At the time, only 80% of Viking kids made it past the age of 5. If a child was sick or seemed weak, they might be left behind, or even drowned in the ocean. Kids also started training as warriors from a very young age, learning all that was needed to be known about weapons and strategy. Meanwhile, the Viking diet was packed with carbs, proteins, and fat, and they were naturally tall and strong, so the average Viking man was always fit and ready for combat. Aside from their warrior mentality, which revolved around their belief in gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, the Vikings had other big advantages. They were experts at constructing sleek, seaworthy longships. These ships allowed them to cross open seas and easily navigate coastal waters. They also had shallow drafts that enabled the Vikings to sail up rivers and estuaries without any trouble and with much speed and agility. When you mix a warrior mentality, superb seafaring skills, and resource scarcity in their homeland, it's no surprise that many Vikings started looking for opportunities abroad. The allure of wealth, land, and adventure in foreign lands was too tempting for the Vikings to resist, as their need for more resources increased. When they first arrived in those new territories, the Vikings began trading and were not immediately hostile. Archaeological evidence shows they brought in silver, silk, spices, weapons, wine, glassware, and various metals. In exchange, they exported fur, wool, tin, amber, feathers, falcons, whalebone, and walrus ivory. Over time, the Vikings emerged as a significant force in European affairs, expanding beyond their established presence in the North Atlantic area. As they traded, they also scouted the landscape for potential targets. On June 8, 793 CE, they launched their first major raid on the island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria. This island was home to the Lindisfarne Monastery, one of the most important centers of learning and religious devotion in early medieval England. Many have speculated on why the Vikings attacked Lindisfarne, and it essentially boils down to two main reasons. First, the Vikings knew it was a place of great wealth and prominence. People had donated gold and precious objects to the monks in exchange for their prayers. These treasures were stored in partitioned areas within the monastic complex, such as the sacristies, where sacred vessels, reliquaries, and other valuable items were kept. The second reason for the attack was the isolated location of Lindisfarne. Far from the centers of political power in Northumbria, this isolation made it vulnerable to attack, as its lack of fortifications and military defenses left it inadequately prepared to resist a surprise and determined assault from the Vikings. If you were to describe the raid on Lindisfarne in just 2 words, they would be brutal and devastating. The Vikings struck without warning, completely surprising the monks and the few guards that protected the monastery. They plundered the monastery's treasures, slaughtered many of the inhabitants, and burned the buildings to the ground. When news spread about the raid throughout Northumberland and Christian Europe, it drew shock and fear from those who heard about it. This didn't happen just because of the lost treasures and lives. It was the violation of the monastery that truly struck terror. To the people of the time, the Vikings were barbaric outsiders, heathens who worshipped different gods. Having them desecrate such a holy site felt like a punch to the gut. Many soon saw it as a sign of divine punishment for the sins of the people, including Alcuin of York, a prominent scholar. He expressed this view in a letter to King Ethelred I of Northumbria. He wrote these words: "Fierce, foreboding omens came over the land of the Northumbrians, and the wretched people shook. There were excessive whirlwinds, lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. These signs were followed by great famine, and a little after those, that same year on the 6th Ides of January, the ravaging of wretched heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. Perhaps if the Vikings had been repelled during the attack on Lindisfarne, such an incident might have been isolated. However, their success became the starting point for a series of Viking raids that continued for decades. In the years following Lindisfarne, Viking raiders struck monasteries, towns, and cities across the British Isles and Ireland. By the mid-9th century, Viking armies were conquering entire kingdoms in England. Viking raiding parties of the time typically consisted of small numbers, traveling in their long and narrow boats. Each boat, depending on its size, could carry between 40 and 100 men and was designed to land directly on a beach, allowing raiders to quickly reach their targets. These boats were adorned with carved figures at the front, often depicting dragons and serpents, which surely struck terror into their victims. Initially, Vikings conducted their raids during the safer summer months, when sea crossings from Scandinavia were less hazardous. After plundering and gathering their loot, they would return home to Scandinavia, where they engaged in farming and animal husbandry to sustain themselves. As time progressed, most Vikings chose not to return home after raiding, but instead settled in the lands they had conquered. This shift was partly due to overpopulation in Scandinavia and the possibility of establishing permanent homes in richer, more fertile lands. By settling, they also had more opportunities to launch further raids on neighboring islands and coastal regions, expanding their territories and influence. Meanwhile, these Viking settlements often resulted in the renaming of conquered places according to Norse traditions and language. For instance, many locations in Scotland, such as Stornoway, Lerwick, and Dingwall, still bear the Norse names given to them during this era. The success of the Vikings in their many raids wasn't solely due to their mastery of surprise and wayfaring skills. They were also helped by the fragmentation of political power and the relative weakness of many coastal kingdoms. These kingdoms often lacked coordinated defenses and were unable to mount effective counterattacks against Viking incursions, which allowed the Vikings to exploit these vulnerabilities and achieve their raiding objectives with greater ease. Faced with relentless Viking raids and the resulting loss of life on both sides, several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England were forced to negotiate agreements with the Vikings. One significant example was the Treaty of Wedmore, also known as the Danelaw, introduced by King Alfred of Wessex in 878 CE. This treaty granted the Vikings dominion over extensive territories in the north and east of England, and also contributed to a period of relative peace and stability in the region. However, it was only a matter of time before the Vikings sought greater power in England. Continued battles in later years eventually led to Sweyn Forkbeard ascending to the throne as the first Viking king of England. He was followed by 3 more Norse kings, Canute the Great, Harold Harefoot, and Harthacnut, each ruling over both Danish and English realms concurrently. Like most dynasties, the Viking Age also came to an end after approximately 3 centuries. The commonly accepted date among scholars is 1066 CE, marked by the death of one of the last great Viking kings, Harald Hardrada, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. After Harold's death, sporadic minor raids still occurred, but the Christianization of Scandinavia throughout the 10th and 11th centuries CE dealt the final blow. As most Vikings embraced Christianity and abandoned their pagan beliefs, the motivation to continue the old ways of raiding and plundering faded away. By the time the Viking Age had finally come to a close, the Vikings had influenced the culture of every nation they encountered in countless ways. Their impact extended from architecture to language, infrastructure to poetry, and even the naming of places. They also left enduring legacies in warfare, military tactics, food, clothing, and shipbuilding. When you look back on how it all began, remember once again that just one raid sparked the age of the Vikings.